So listen, what I want to start with is like, if we were having a conversation at a normal crypto conference, right, and I'd got Solana, Hedera, and Stellar up on stage, it might be a kind of a competition about who's got the best scaling solution, right? And the essence of what that issue is, and all of you have built incredible solutions for this problem where we want security, right? And security in the Web3 world is really often defined as how truly decentralized is it, so that there cannot be a man-in-the-middle attack, so that you can't have some centralized entity take over the network and so forth. And so how do you achieve decentralization, which is often expensive and complicated and cumbersome, and at the same time scale? And so there's been a variety of different consensus mechanisms developed and hybrids and so forth to sort of find this sweet spot, if you like, between security and scalability. And so each of them, and we won't go into it because we're going to talk about something else here, have different versions of it. But what I'd like to be able to talk about in some respects are the economics and the incentives that come with that, right? Because really, in some respects, Solana, Hedera, and Stellar are in a competition to prove that their network is in fact the best one to build on, because you've got the best hybrid solution of security and scalability. But actually what we're talking about here is, how do we actually get you guys to work together? How do we find the linkages between them so that this very valuable contribution that Web3 brings to this, decentralized, I think Ken talked about minimum trust registry, right? So the idea that we don't have to trust OpenAI or Microsoft's index or any centralized party to actually maintain that registry, Web3 has some pretty good ideas how to fix that. But what we want to do is get out of our own intranet siloed problems and get there. So I want to talk a little bit about that, sort of almost the economics of it all, right? Because you're constantly trying to keep builders building on Stellar, and you've got to make sure that Stellar wins here. How do you now, at the same time, because we have to all come together somehow and tackle the big sort of centralized alternative. Garand, I'll let you start. How do you think about this? What is the way to sort of start with an interoperability solution from that perspective of that problem? And there's a microphone for you. Good.
The perspective of the economic issue,
yeah,
in particular. Well, I think one of the issues that blockchain has gotten as it's kind of scaled up and become more mainstream is that there are really two distinct technologies at play here. There's blockchain technology, distributed ledger technology, and then there's cryptocurrency. And those are kind of synonyms now, but they really don't have to be. And so when I think about a AI registry, we don't really, like, while a cryptocurrency may have use cases for paying agents and having agents have autonomy in how they can transact funds, the actual core of what you need in the index is just a decentralized agreement, which is just pure blockchain. And so I think when it comes to having decentralization in a space that's not intrinsically financial, it's important that your consensus algorithms and how you actually think about decentralization is not economically backed. And so I think that's one of the critiques I would have of kind of the modern proof of stake or proof of work systems that we have today, is that because there is this reliance on the economic kind of security and the economics of the cryptocurrency in order to make consensus work, you start that chain, I think, will be always sort of moving towards financial applications, which is what we've seen. Whereas I think this is kind of the first example of a truly non-financial application that we need to be decentralized and need to be on a DLT. And I think as of yet, while the potential for a non-financial sort of system is possible with blockchain, we actually haven't seen one in practice yet. And so I think we might have to rethink some of the incentive models and maybe rethink that tokenomics, revenue generation, and things like that may not be the best metrics and the best things to build for when it comes to this context.
But isn't the token central to the security proposition? It is essential to the incentive model for the consensus framework, right?
Well, I think it depends on how you construct your consensus. So if you look at a proof of stake sort of model, the validators are incentivized to participate in the network because they make a direct profit from running validators. They are incentivized to be infrastructure providers, and so they are infrastructure provider companies and entities. But I think in something like this, the incentive isn't actually, doesn't need to be directly profitable, right? And so I like to think of it more as like a Windows versus a Linux sort of situation. Now, if you look at modern day Linux, you have all the big tech companies, Meta, IBM, even Microsoft, even though they own Windows, that are all contributing to Linux for free. And they do profit from this, but indirectly because they're building interesting products. And so what I think is that in order to best align the incentives, what we need is not these infrastructure companies trying to essentially be there so they can maximize profit, maximize transaction fees, maximize revenue, but rather the builders of the agents and the people who can profit from these agents directly, but not from the blockchain or the consensus directly, need to be participating. And so I think a federated consensus model that's not financially backed, is better to factor into these issues because I think it would actually be very decentralized if you had OpenAI, NVIDIA, Anthropic, all these different companies actually participating in this network. I think that's probably, in addition to perhaps some academic institutions like MIT running nodes as well. But I think that's probably my view, where you have these folks that are doing it for free or even at a small loss, but it makes the ecosystem better for everyone, and thus their agentic models can be more profitable.
So it's kind of a hybrid from the broad permissionless, anything goes kind of consensus mechanism, one that actually brings in this federation structure. So you've got these parties that do it. Hedera's got something to say about that because you've got your own consortium and your membership, but it feeds into a decentralized structure as well. So tell us a little bit about that and how you think it could expand into this wider network, Shyam. At the bottom, I think. Right there. Yes.
Hello?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Shyam Nagarajan, CEO at Hedera, Hashgraph. Hedera is a little bit different compared to some of the other fully permissionless, decentralized blockchain protocols. We are a specialty consensus-driven protocol that was designed as a utilitarian network for all organizations to build immutable ledger-based apps. And we designed it as a public but a permission network. So therefore, it is our nodes are run by very high-profile designated enterprises like Google, IBM, some of these financial institutions, academic institutions, they are the ones that actually own and run these networks, run these nodes. On top of it, we are a proof of stake, but our incentives for these validators are not on staking. It's more about ensuring there is trust in the network that it offers. So coming back to the question of economic incentives for organizations to use and not game the system because the coin value and the likes, we focus on ensuring there is transaction finality. There's no ability to do MEVs. Therefore, there is fair ordering of all transactions, and therefore, better business utilitarian access and enforcement. What does this mean for organizations that wants to build on a trust layer? That's where we believe Hedera comes in. We are able to provide data. When you build AI applications, data is at your core. So being able to manage all the way from the inception and data ownership and provenance to attestation of AI models, making use of those data to make decisions, and eventually the governance, the auditability, the full traceability, to a level up from there. Now, when you have this trust layer of backend on all of these, then you're able to start to build AI agents that you can actually trust. Then you're able to enforce things like identity, authentication, and the ability to do agent-to-agent communication with the right level of incentives, enforcement, and as well as economic settlement between all these organizations. So infrastructure is really important. I think incentives aligned with the appropriate infrastructure is even more important. But good governance is even more important in order for this infrastructure to be used by the day-to-day business. That includes OpenAI, Google, and the likes.
All right, and Rishin, just yours, because Solana, in some respects, people see as the protocol, the blockchain that is the closest to being an Ethereum killer, right? I mean, you had a lot of success. The build on Solana has been impressive. It's got the, I think probably after Ethereum, the largest value locked, right? Again, how do you that's a success story from a very pure capitalist perspective, but we're talking here about something that goes beyond this, right? So how do you think about that, and how does Solana think about how it is going to almost escape from its own trap almost of its success in this kind of closed environment.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks again for having me. Where we've been spending a lot of time is thinking about what sort of economic activity and transactions that aren't just going to be happening on chain, but just in general are going to be applicable into the future. Today, realistically, if you look at the economic value that's being created by blockchains, it's fundamentally mostly people that are able to issue tokens as like an alternative form of capital on chain. And that's being done by humans. If you think into the future where agentic commerce and machine-to-machine transactions and payments are going to be the standard versus kind of like a test use case, that's a worldview which we're building towards. So more concretely, like the base level infrastructure of Solana exists today and continually is being improved by some of the folks over at Anza and like that's one part of it, the core infrastructure when you're actually talking about how much TPS you can do, like what transaction cost looks like. And where I've been spending a lot of time and where my team has been spending a lot of time is thinking about like where are the relevant intersections between what's happening in broader Web2 AI and where blockchains can actually be useful to that. And so one primary application that we've been exploring quite a bit has been kind of at the payments layer, where it comes to like exchange of economic value, paying for services, settling for services. Again, in machine-to-machine payments, agentic workflows, these are points in time where like API credit systems that were built fundamentally for humans, subscription models that were built for like enterprise SaaS level contracts start to make a little bit less sense. And we've been working very closely with teams like Coinbase and even Anthropic on building our X402 standard, which is an unused internet protocol standard that basically requires a payload with an API request.
We're going to have a little bit of a conversation about payments a little later on, and I might bring you back on stage to talk about that. What I'd like to do now, though, is like to take this and say, okay, how do we take the particular qualities and characteristics and benefits that each of your systems have and apply that to this NANDA, the quilt, the Web3 quilt concept that we're talking about, the NANDA index. And one of the things that struck me listening to the way that Ramesh and others are framing this is this idea of agent facts, right? The credentials, essentially the idea that this is an agent. Not only does it have these characteristics, but that there's actually the capacity to verify whether this is a well-behaved agent. This is an agent that I can trust. And something that blockchains have often been touted as being valuable for is a decentralized mechanism of provenance that we can have a record of truth that shows this performance here. Thoughts on that and how you can apply not just your blockchain structures to those solutions to particular customers who might want those values in their agents, but literally use it such that the registry we're talking about here, this interoperable registry, is able to take that agent facts and that agent credentialing into an interoperable cross-platform and cross-chain environment. So I want to just focus on that, and then I'm going to see if we can bring somebody else in after that. Yeah, Garand.
So I think on the interoperability case, I think the most important factor for something like this is that it is a federated system that's not based on proof of stake. And in order to do that, I think it's important that you be agnostic to what blockchain you're building on. Now, the reason I say that is imagine a scenario where you have, say, AI medical agents that are scanning your CT scans or something like that. This is a very high risk and trusted sort of use case. And so at least me personally, I would want the agents I'm using to be vetted by someone like the NIH or the FDA or some sort of a governing body, right? And to do this, I think you need some sort of federation. Now, in a non-federated system, essentially there is one global network, and that network essentially votes, and there's one decision they come to. You have to trust everyone on the network. But in a federated system, you can have these local groups of trust. And so, for instance, I can trust the NIH or whatever, and then the NIH can have their local group where they decide what agents are medically accessible or whatnot. But let's say, I think it's very important that because the applications of this are so important, they need to be federated. And so how that works for interoperability, I don't want to see this on a single blockchain. I think that would probably be poor because whoever has the most stake or control over that network would control the registry. And so I think to do that, what you need is that you need to make sure that the registry itself really is just data and that you call it and it has a unified interface, but that's accessed primarily via off-chain means. And so I don't think the correct solution is to have some sort of like bridging mechanism or to make sure that, all state is always on chain, but rather I think that you need to keep the on-chain state to a minimum, but just make sure it's unified, such that the dispatcher, the router, if you will, could call an index entry that's on Stellar, that's on Solana, that's on Hedera. It doesn't matter because they all have a unified interface, and the actual data might be secured differently, whether it's like a federated agreement system like Stellar or proof of stake or something in between. But it gives the both the agent creator essentially the flexibility to decide where they're trusted. It reduces the amount of centralization. It reduces the amount of power that any single entity or every single network has.
Okay. Their respect.
Okay, so from my perspective, we've been participating and working with Nanda from the day one. So it's been pretty interesting journey. I'm thrilled to see the progress that we have made. I completely agree with you. The conversation about blockchain is almost agnostic to what protocol it is. But that said, you do need some common infrastructure and trust abilities in order for you to use these into bringing it into the AI world. Hedera has been working on several standards which align with Nanda framework in implementing registries, agent-agent communications, and as well as the agent economy. And we're going to talk a bit about that later in the day. The acceleration is going to come from the acceptance that the new world of agent AI is going to be diverse. There's not going to be one particular solution, but a loosely weaved ability to transfer trust and use the W3C kind of credentials. It's not just that, but I think there's several levels of advancement necessary. But being able to have verifiable credentials that you can trust, transfer, and not just be accepted because it's presented, but be also verified by multiple sources is probably going to be necessary in order for this to go into the next level. But we are accelerating. I can already see the change from inception of the Nanda framework to where we are right now, and I'm looking forward to further collaboration. So it's interesting.
Okay, just quickly, Rohit, so we can, your thoughts on this particular aspect of it, the value of provenance on chain and how you can be applied to the registry.
Yeah, I think like discoverability is going to be like it's the biggest problem to solve in like agentic Web 2 world right now. That's like the stack that everybody wants to own. It's not going to be much different for Web 3 and blockchains either. And so like, yeah, I think the difference between like Web 2 versus Web 3 is like there's potential for less of a PvP world in this use case where like, registries and data can be hashed and read across chains. So yeah, like it's about kind of like collecting activity behaviors and compiling this such that users know what they're interacting with.
Okay. So now I'm going to do something, and you should not take this personally. You just happen to be sitting at the end, so it's easier to do this. Can you just leave? This is not the gong show. You're not getting kicked off. You did perfectly fine. Good job. But I'm just going to bring in a couple of people just because I think this is the way I want to